Welcome everybody to the 15th Art Mind Symposium. And our speaker tonight is Dr. Dan Glaser. Dan is Head of Engaging Science at Wellcome Trust and soon to be Director of Science Engagement at the King's College Cultural Institute, which you might ask about a bit later. Anyway, his scientific background involves brain imaging in the visual system. In 2002, he was appointed Scientist in Residence at London's Institute of Contemporary Arts. And in 2005, received a Cultural Leadership Award from the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts. He has presented a television series for BBC and co-chairs the Café Scientifique Photographers Gallery. I will mention that his first appearance in the world ever was at an Art Mind festival in a pub in Winchester. And I'm going to cut that short, which we can discuss later, and all its embarrassing implications. Anyway, okay, Dan's going to talk about, is finding art useful a problem? So we've wound him up, off he goes.
Thanks, Gary. And it is the case in a previous version of that anecdote, which I have heard, I can't remember when, that we had to pay the audience to leave on the previous occasion. So I'm sure that that will be the case this evening as well. Gary, it's a real pleasure to be here. Robert, thank you very much for having me. And it's lovely to see... So it's lovely both to see familiar faces and unfamiliar faces here this evening. And it's tremendous to be able to talk to you on the subject of, is finding art useful a problem? So, you know, hello Podworld, this talk is going to go up in the morning, and, you know, this is part of a small conversation. There's a thing on Thursday, today's Tuesday, which is going to happen at GV Arts. If people out there aren't going, or people in here aren't coming, then you should. And it's also part of a bigger conversation about, you know, the instrumentalisation of art and all that. And I suppose in preparing for the talk, I thought I would choose a provocative title. And given that we've all had, you know, dinner and a few drinks, it seemed to me useful to sort of point out that it was a provocative title. And so my plan, right, in the next 15 minutes or so, is to explain, you know, is to introduce the straw man in the room, in the title, right, and then to discuss some stuff about the relationships between, as it were, art and, you know, as it were, probably in my case, science, right, you know, another part of the conversation. And that's roughly the plan. As Gary mentioned, I'm kind of in transition at the moment, right? So I'm Head of Engaging Science at Wellcome Trust, and so what I've been doing for the last 7 years or so is thinking about how to engage broad public audiences with biomedical science. And as many of you will know, the reason for that is kind of interesting. We'll come back to the reason for it, but it's because founder of the Wellcome Trust, Sir Henry Wellcome, believed, for reasons which I think are interesting, I mean, well, in fact, I'm convinced are interesting, but I'm not going to go into, that science and medicine are part of culture, right? And so it was kind of incontestably held by him, right? It was a belief that he held centrally and unquestioningly that scientific endeavour, medicine, pharmaceutical chemistry, as it was for him, the concoction and marketing and branding and selling and profit-making from drugs, the thinking behind that, the science, the biology, was part of culture. And he evidenced that belief in his collecting policy. When he died, as I'm sure many of you know, 1936, he had more objects in his collection than were in the Louvre at that time. And the objects spanned the entire range of culture, right? I mean, they weren't just recipes for chemicals or drugs, but they were the vials in which the drugs were contained and dispensed, the masks which the witch doctors wore when they dispensed them, the canoes in which they travelled to dispense their remedies from across the world, and the shrouds in which their patients were often quite soon after buried. And this sort of sense of it being important to capture all the culture around science and medicine was central to what he did. And indeed the vision for what is now Wellcome Collection, 183 Euston Road, was a museum of man, which contained everything you needed to know about the human, and as such contained, you know, medicine, biology, but also psychology, anthropology, and art. And that belief of Sir Henry's allows Wellcome Trust, which I'm now leaving, to fund art the engagement with science as a core part of our mission. So unlike some research councils, for example, when times are hard, who can drop the engagement of science as a core activity, we can't do that at Wellcome because it's written in Sir Henry's will from 1936. Forces us, compels us to do that, and we're delighted, with that injunction, because we don't have to have, on a daily basis, the kind of argument which I'm hoping to provoke this evening about whether finding art useful is a problem or not. Okay, so that's where I'm coming from, and where I'm going to. And I had a really, really good day today, but I'm not at liberty to disclose exactly why. But I'm moving to King's to be part of the King's Cultural Institute, and part of the plan is to form a thing called Science Gallery. And so let me start the ball rolling by saying that Science Gallery at King's College London is going to use art and design to engage a broad public with science. Right? So we're going to have artistic and design credentials at the heart of the way in which we construct an attractive public venue for broad audiences to engage with the science that's on the Guy's campus. This place is going to be right by London Bridge. And the communities around there, tourists, locals and others. Okay. So, is finding art useful a problem? To explain the nature of the straw man I've built for you to throw your wine glasses at and your vitriol and your bile as the discussion ensues after the camera's turned off. No, the answer is no, I think, to the question. And what would it be like to find finding art useful a problem? Right? What that would be like would be to get really, really pissed off if people used art for other purposes. Okay? And I'm going to argue that there is no intrinsic problem with finding art useful, right? As some people find money useful, sex useful, ideas useful, stuff useful, people exploit stuff to get places. And the exploitation of art to reach goals that you want to reach is not intrinsically a problem. Okay? Just to cut to the chase, the intrinsic problem is if you don't believe that there's anything else to art but its utility. If you believe that there's nothing to art but its utility, then we have a problem. But if you believe there is a utility to art, then we don't. There we go. I can sit down now, except Robert's taken my chair away, so I'll have to keep going for a little bit longer. Okay? So, let me give you some of the people to chuck your... We don't have napkins exactly, but your napkins at, your paper napkins at, would be... was it Labour's arts thing? Was about the national economy, right? That the value of the arts was in boosting the national economy. We could cash it out. And in a funny way, the current instantiation of the culture wars, I think they've rolled back, haven't they, the EBAC? I mean, they're not going to do that anymore. But the bit where there was no humanities in that, the bit where you could get subsidised to do a science course but not an art course, which is, there is the ongoing culture wars element of all of that. And, God bless the Tories, they will always, when they're at their best, express that stuff in a way that makes it really clear what right-thinking people think about these issues. Yeah. So the bit where we cashed out science but not art, but there was no cash value given to an art degree or a humanities degree, was the bit where we realised that that wasn't right. In other words, that we said arts are useful for the rich, for the dilettantes, in the service of culture as part of the national economy, but there's no intrinsic value. That's where the problem lies. Okay. So what I want to do in the discussion is to think about some ways in which I've found art useful. Okay. But I'm going to argue that an appreciation of the value of art outside its utility has actually been central to the success of most of my endeavours, most of my encounters with art, and I imagine, for various reasons, to the endeavours of the people around the table. Right? So I'm going to argue that it's okay to find art useful, just so long as you also don't find it useful. As long as you have value outside its utility. So let me do the bit which is called art as the handmaiden to science bit. Right? So it seems to me that one of the useful things about art is that it, and I think the Russian formalists had this right, it defamiliarizes stuff. Right? So, I mean, again, there probably are people in the room who can correct me on this. Robert told me not to invite questions at this point, so go or something if I'm wrong on this, but roughly speaking, the Russian formalists, and we'll discuss it afterwards when the camera's off, but the Russian formalists believed that the heart of art was defamiliarization, which is that you take something that is familiar and you put it in a frame, sometimes literally, sometimes metaphorically, and the frame could be around a picture or the proscenium arch of a theatre, or an invitation to a happening. But you take an event or a feeling or a thought that's familiar, you defamiliarize it by some formal contextual intervention, and by defamiliarizing it, you make it art. I mean, that was their claim. And this, what I call loosening process, this process by which things which were familiar become unfamiliar, this sense of partial resonance, and I'll expand on that sense in a second, is quite useful. It's quite a helpful thing to happen. And it turns out that art is not the only human practice to employ such techniques. So, for example, a sermon, right, which oh God, I had an echo when I said that. A sermon, which happens in churches and places of worship, in synagogues and so on, it has a similar effect. It takes familiar practice, it builds from the everyday, it frames it in a certain way, and in a way that is supposed to be morally useful. By rooting its description of everyday practice in an unfamiliar context, it allows us to better ourselves. And in the communication of science and the engagement with science, which is what we call it these days, art can play a similarly useful role. Why? Because artists have this, shall we say, habit or ability to take almost anything and reconceptualize it in their own terms, and we say in their own practice. So you can throw an artist at stuff, or throw stuff at an artist, right? And she will say, oh, shiny, interesting, and reconceptualize it in her own terms. And that loosening, that redescription of the thing that you've allowed the artist to encounter is helpful for the rest of us. And by the rest of us, I mean those who are non-artists. And I want to make it clear, despite having been the world's first artist in residence as a scientific institution, I have no... Did I say that wrong?
Yes, you did.
As the world's first scientist in residence, at the world's first scientist in residence as an artistic institution, I have no artistic pretensions myself. I do not pretend to artistic sensibility myself, right? But somehow, having things redescribed by artists is useful to me, because it allows me to look at the science, look at these facts, no longer as on high, right? But it allows me to assume control, partially, of the interpretation of the scientific facts around me. Okay? There's a power dynamic at play here, which I'm going to refer to again in a minute. But certainly in contemporary culture, 2013 and all, not just because of the Tories and the automatic funding for science but not the arts, there is a kind of ascendancy to scientific accounts of truth and rationality to the world we live in. And arts can play a useful role in loosening that, because they redescribe it in their own terms. And once you've seen an artist take a gospel truth bit of science and redescribe it in the medium of photography, pseudo-autoradiograms, if I may say, that's helpful, because it says, well, if she can do it, maybe I can. Maybe there's a role for me, maybe there's a place for my own sense of what's going on here, my own redescription of these scientific facts, which will allow me to engage with the scientific truths and participate, at least in the interpretation of knowledge, if not its construction. Right? So that's a useful thing that the arts can do in the engagement of science. And I don't need to say this, but because Sir Henry made me do this anyway. But being responsible for a lot of funding for the public engagement of science, art is useful in that process because it has this loosening effect, this partial resonance, which allows people to engage with things more on their own terms. Okay? Now, here are some ways in which that can go wrong, and I think this is part, to my mind, this is part of the backlash against the instrumentalisation of artistic practice in the context of the dominant position of arts funding which science can sometimes adopt. So Wellcome Trust, for us, 3% of our funding is for engagement, even less for arts, but we're pretty big players nonetheless in the funding of culture in this country. And why is there a backlash against that? And I think there's a couple of reasons for it. The first is a more general fact, which I've become increasingly aware of as I get older or become more familiar in cultural context, and that's what I call the principle of universal competence. Okay? So what's the principle of universal competence? It's not something which only scientists suffer from. It's mostly men. It's mostly white men. It's mostly white men above the age of 50. It's mostly successful white men above the age of 50. And what they suffer from is the principle of universal competence. What it says is because they're very good at one thing, which gives them a certain status in society, often they're directors of things, that means that they must be good at everything. Right? And this principle of universal competence, I mean, it's part of this old joke I had years ago, which I never really understood till I got older. Why is it good to have women astronauts? Because if you're lost in space, there's somebody who's prepared to ask the way. Right? This principle of universal competence means that if you've become the director of something, you're competent to become the director of anything. Right? And in particular, in the way that art is used in culture, is used in the engagement of science. Again, shall I cite the person there? There was someone I came across in a professional society for one of the main branches of science. It might have been physics, it might have been an institute, but it might have been chemistry, and it might have been a bit. And they wanted to do some theatre. When I said, so how did you do that? They said, well, we said we wanted to do a theatre production for children, and we invited a bunch of theatre companies to send in some proposals, and then we read the proposal, and we decided which one was the best, and we brought them in, and we explained the physics, and we did this thing for kids. I'm like, what, really? You guys did that? Like, you read the proposals from the theatre company, you chose which one was the best, and then you kind of directed it? And they were like, yeah, because, we know about physics, and we know about engagement, and so on. And I was like, wow! And for me it was a real insight into, a lot of the, historically, and again, I'm very happy to give this address within GV Arts. By exclusion, a lot of the kind of rubbish sci art that's arisen over the years is because people who don't know anything about art, through the principle of universal competence and through its utility, believe that they are able to, as it were, curate and judge it. Okay? So the problem with finding art useful is that you believe that that's all there is to it, that its utility allows you to be an expert in it and to judge it, right? And effectively to undermine the professional status of those who have a professional interest, who are curators, who are artists, who really know about this stuff, who understand the intrinsic value of it, right? Who are, as it were, artists or curators. The fact that it's useful can enable people with control over the purse strings and, in some cases, audiences, to engage effectively with art, but it doesn't give them the right to say what is good art. Now, the question of good art, to me, was made most poignant in a recent visit to Israel. I went to see a friend of mine who recently had cancer. She seems to be doing okay for now. But I thought I should go and hold her hand as she spent time in a lot of hospitals. There was a particular hospital in Petah Tikva that we went to in Israel, and there's a donor who had read about the value of art for recovery from illness. There is some literature on this, and it's sort of unquestionably true, but he thought he should do something with the limited findings that were available. And he has built, at the crossroads of this hospital, a gallery which covers all of the history of art, Western art, from the 16th century onwards. Every single fucking painting that you've ever seen that's famous, he's got a version of it, right? And they're all knockoffs. They're all just like somebody's done one. They're not rubbish. I couldn't have done it, but they're clearly, varying degrees of inferiority. I was so amazed, I'm not going to show you, but I took a video and I walked along this kind of entire gallery, and it's got the sunflowers, and it's got, everything there. And the question I asked myself was, is kind of rubbish art, like knockoff of great art or inferior art, going to make you recover any less quickly on the ward, right, than the real thing? Right? In other words, what are the curatorial values which it's worth applying if your principal criterion is turfing up bed blockers? It's like actually moving people on. Like, if you don't care that the reason that they've left is because the string quartet is rubbish, because they can feel better, does it really matter? And so it does seem to me that there is a problem around the instrumentalisation of art, in the sense that it is, at its heart, Philistine. If it's all you believe in, then you can just do And I mean, I don't want to big up randomised controlled trials, but you could just fill one hospital with like properly curated stuff like what Robert's got on his walls, and you could fill another one with some knockoff rubbish and see who got better quicker. And then you could conclude the value of art. Can you apply for that grant? Unfortunately, I've just left Wellcome. Did I mention that earlier? That's probably why I'm able to say stuff. So, is finding art useful a problem? No, unless you believe that that's all there is that's to it. In other words, we should be able, those of us who don't know anything about art, talk about art with people who do. With due respect, I'm not going to do my whole Dionysian frenzy argument, but we ought to construct spaces in which it's okay for people who know about it and people who don't to speak on equal footing. But we ought to recontextualise that, feels to me, back in spaces where we're within our own disciplines where we know what we're talking about. So there is still, in my view, value for art galleries that people are prepared to come to, potentially so often buy stuff. You know, like there is a commercial value for the intrinsic nature of art, and there's criticism of art, there's a discourse around art which is self-referential, which looks to itself, to value itself, and we should be happy with scientific practice, okay, you know, which does peer review and tries to make progress on biology and everything. And we should celebrate the bits where they intersect, right, without worrying too much about finding each other useful every so often. We're all users in the end, okay? But we also have to assert the value of other people's understanding of what they're doing. The value, intrinsic value of art has to be maintained. And my belief, untested, we could do a trial on this, is that if you respect the intrinsic value of art, then it will be more useful to you. There's a paradox in there. If you respect the intrinsic value of art, it'll be more useful to you. Okay. So, around the table we've got people who are artists, I think, by their own admission. Certainly there are people who are scientists, and people who've used each other in various contexts over the years. So I'm going to wrap up there and hope that we'll have a good discussion as soon as the camera's turned off.